I had just stepped out of the recovery room when I found out my sister had changed the locks on our father's house. Not a phone call, not a text. I found out because I drove 40 minutes from the hospital to his place in Barrie, Ontario, still wearing the paper bracelet from when they'd admitted me 2 days earlier for observation after my own cardiac scare. And my key didn't work. I stood on that front porch in February, the wind coming off Kempenfelt Bay like it always does in the middle of winter, rattling the bare birch trees my father had planted when I was 7 years old. I knocked. I rang the bell. I called his cell 3 times. Nothing. I'm not telling the story to make myself sound like a victim. I'm 51 years old. I'm a high school shop teacher in Collingwood. I've fixed my own truck, raised 2 kids mostly on my own after my marriage fell apart, and I've never once asked anyone for anything I couldn't eventually figure out myself. But standing on that porch, I want you to understand something. My father had just had hip replacement surgery 4 days earlier. He was 74 years old, recovering, and supposed to be inside that house. And the locks had been changed. My father's name is Norman Fielding, 74 years old, retired heavy equipment operator, widower. He spent 35 years working for a road construction company out of Barrie, drove graders and excavators all over northern Ontario, and came home every Friday no matter what the weather was doing. He's the kind of man who fixes things. Gutters, engines, people's feelings. Not with words. Norman Fielding is not a man who uses a lot of words, but with showing up. He was always just there. That was the whole thing about him. He was always just there. My sister Charlotte is 46. She's married to a man named Vincent Marchand, 49, who is a financial advisor in Orillia. They have a nice house, 2 cars, a hot tub on the back deck. I've never disliked Vincent exactly. He's the kind of person you find difficult to have a strong opinion about. Smooth, agreeable in the way that doesn't actually commit to anything. Charlotte has been different since she married him. That's the only way I can think to describe it. She used to call our father every Sunday. She used to drive up from Orillia for his birthday, for Christmas, just because. After Vincent, those calls started getting further apart. The visits stopped. The reason was always something. The kids had activities. Vincent had clients. The drive was long. It was always something. 3 years ago, our father started having trouble with his hip. He'd walk with this hitch in his step and wave off anyone who mentioned it. When I finally got him to see his doctor, the x-rays showed bone grinding on bone. The surgeon, a young woman in Barrie named Dr. Priya Anand, told him he needed a full replacement and that waiting would only make the surgery harder. My father agreed eventually. He's not stubborn about everything, just most things. Charlotte came to visit once in those 3 years. Once. She sat in my father's kitchen for 2 hours, drank his coffee, and spent most of the time telling him he should sell the house and move into something more manageable. My father listened, the way he always listens, quietly, with his hands folded on the table, and then he said he wasn't ready for that. Charlotte sighed and looked at Vincent, and Vincent did that thing he does where he nods slowly as though he's considering something profound. They left before supper. When my father was booked for surgery in January, I took the week off school and drove to Barrie. I was there the morning of, in the waiting room with a bad Tim Hortons coffee while they wheeled him in. I was there when he came out. He looked small in the hospital bed, which is something I was not prepared for. Norman Fielding has never looked small to me in my entire life. Charlotte called once while he was in recovery. The call lasted 4 minutes. I know because I was sitting right there. He was discharged on a Thursday. I drove him home, helped him get settled, made sure his prescriptions were filled at the Shoppers on Dunlop Street, stocked his fridge with things he could manage, soup, yogurt, sandwich stuff, and made a list of the physiotherapy appointments Dr. Anand's office had scheduled. I told my father I'd be back on the weekend. He told me he was fine. That's also a Norman Fielding thing. He's always fine. I drove back to Collingwood Thursday evening. Friday morning, Charlotte called me. She did not ask how he was doing. She said, and I want to be accurate here because I've replayed this enough times that I'm confident in the words. Dad needs consistent support right now, and I think it's better if we manage his recovery without you coming and going all the time and confusing things. I asked her what she meant by that. She said she and Vincent had talked to their family lawyer about something called a supportive care arrangement, and that they were going to be taking a more active role in our father's day-to-day decisions during his recovery. I said, Charlotte, he just had a hip replacement. He doesn't need a lawyer. He needs soup and someone to drive him to physio. She said, we're just trying to do what's best for him. I asked to speak to Dad. She said he was resting. That was Friday. On Saturday, I drove back to Barrie. My key didn't work. The locks had been changed. I stood on that porch for probably 10 minutes before I did anything else. I'll be honest with you. Part of what I was doing was trying not to cry, which is not something I'm proud of but is the truth. My father was in that house, recovering from surgery, and my sister had locked me out. I didn't understand it. I still don't, not completely. The best I can make of it is that Vincent had decided, or the two of them had decided together, that I was a complication, that my presence meant they weren't fully in control, and Vincent Marchand strikes me as a man who does not easily tolerate things he can't control. I called my father's landline. He has an old cordless phone he keeps on the side table in the living room. It rang 7 times, which means he was moving slow to get to it, which means he was there, which meant everything Charlotte had told me was a lie arranged to keep me away. He picked up on the 8th ring. "Dad," I said, "I'm on your porch. Can you let me in?" A pause. "Then the locks are different." "I know," I said. Another pause. "Charlotte said it was for security." I didn't say anything to that. I waited. "I'll come to the door," he said. He came to the door. It took him 4 minutes. I could hear him working his way down the hall with the walker. And when he opened it, he looked at me and I looked at him. And he said, "I didn't know she was going to do that." I believed him. That's the thing about my father. He's never once lied to me in 51 years. He said things I didn't want to hear, and sometimes he said nothing when he should have said something, but he has never lied. I came inside. We sat at the kitchen table. He made tea slowly, the way he does everything now, and I didn't try to help him because I know better. He told me that Charlotte and Vincent had been there on Friday, the day I drove home. They'd brought groceries. He described what they'd bought, things he doesn't eat, low-sodium crackers and protein bars, and Charlotte had stayed to sort out the house. That was how he described it. Sort out the house. She'd taken his spare keys and said she was going to make copies. She'd spoken to someone on the phone in the other room for a long time. She'd left a printed schedule on the counter covering his physio appointments, mealtimes, and medication, and it didn't match anything Dr. Anand's office had told us. "She means well," my father said. "I know," I said. We sat there with our tea. Outside, a snowplow went by on the street, and we both watched it through the kitchen window the way you do in winter in Ontario when there's nothing else to say. I called Charlotte that afternoon. The call went the way I expected it to go. She said I was being defensive. She said I wasn't there enough. She said that she and Vincent had done their research and that they were taking a proper approach to supporting Dad's recovery, as opposed to dropping in and disrupting things. I asked her when she had last spent more than 2 hours with our father. She hung up. I want to be fair here. I know grief does strange things to people, and we lost our mother 6 years ago. And I think Charlotte took that differently than I did. I think losing our mother made Charlotte afraid of losing our father, and I think Vincent channeled that fear into something that felt like control, but probably looked like caring, from the inside. I'm not saying she doesn't love our father. I'm saying that love was getting used in a way that wasn't actually about him. But understanding something doesn't make it easier to live through. Over the next 3 weeks, I called my father every day. Sometimes Charlotte answered his phone. Sometimes the calls went to voicemail and he'd call back an hour later, his voice a little careful, a little measured, the way it gets when someone is listening in another room. Once, he didn't call back at all. I drove to Barrie the next morning, and Charlotte's car was in the driveway, and she answered the door and told me my father was resting and that she'd let him know I stopped by. "I'd like to see him," I said. "He needs to rest," she said. I looked past her into the front hall. I could see his walker by the staircase, and his coat on the hook by the door, and the stack of library books on the side table he'd been working through all winter. Everything looked exactly like his house. It smelled like his house, and I could not get in. "Charlotte," I said. "He's my father too," she said. "I'm aware," and closed the door. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes before I drove home. My father's first physiotherapy appointment was scheduled for a Tuesday at a clinic on Bayfield Street. I knew this because I had the original schedule from Dr. Anand's office. I drove to Barrie that Tuesday morning and parked down the street from the clinic and felt deeply ridiculous doing it. But I also didn't know what else to do. At 11:15, a car pulled up, not Charlotte's, a different car, which I learned later was Vincent's brother's, and my father got out slowly, the walker first, then himself. I got out of my truck and walked over. He saw me coming and stopped. He didn't look surprised? Exactly. He looked like a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just seen a place to put it down. "Hey, Dad," I said. "Hey," he said. We walked into the clinic together. He didn't say anything about Charlotte. I didn't either. The physiotherapist's name was Gordon Achibi. 38 years old, originally from Hamilton, calm and methodical in the way that good physio people tend to be. He introduced himself, shook my father's hand, and then looked at me. My father said, "This is my son, James. He's going to be here today." And Gordon nodded and said, "Good," and that was the whole thing. After the appointment, I drove my father home. We stopped at the Swiss Chalet on Dunlop for lunch, which he wanted, because he'd been eating Charlotte's low-sodium crackers for 3 weeks, and he said he could not eat another one. We sat across from each other, and he had the quarter chicken, and I had the half, and we ate without talking much, which is how we've always eaten together, and it felt like something coming back to normal. He said, "She's going to be angry." "I know," I said. "I don't want you two fighting over me like I'm a piece of furniture. I know that too." He looked out the window for a moment. "Your mother always managed her. I never had the knack for it." That was the most he said about it. Charlotte called me that evening. She had found out, I assume from Vincent's brother, or from my father, or from some combination, that I'd taken my father to physio and then to lunch. She was not calm. She used the word undermining 3 times. She said I was putting my own feelings ahead of Dad's health. She said she had spoken to a lawyer about what rights I had to insert myself in their care arrangement. I said, "Charlotte, he's a 74-year-old man who wanted Swiss Chalet. He doesn't need a care arrangement. He needs his son." She said, "You've never taken this seriously." I said, "I was there the morning of the surgery. Where were you?" That was the wrong thing to say. I knew it as I said it. The call ended badly. After, I sat in my kitchen in Collingwood and looked at the wall for a while. I teach 16-year-olds how to use a table saw and a router and how to read a set of plans. I am generally a person who can figure out what the next step is. I had no idea what the next step was. The following Saturday, I drove to Barrie again. Not to fight. I didn't have a plan exactly. I just felt like if I stopped showing up, it would mean something I didn't want it to mean. Charlotte's car was there. I knocked. She answered, and before she could say anything, I said, "I'm not here to argue. I just want to see my dad." She looked at me for a moment. Then she stepped back and let me in. My father was in the living room in his chair by the window, the one he's had since I was a teenager, dark green corduroy, with a particular quality of sunken inness that means it's his and no one else's. He was watching a curling match on the television with the volume low. He looked better than he had in February. His color was better. He was moving easier. He looked up and said, "You brought anything? Should I have? Coffee would have been nice." Charlotte made coffee in the kitchen. The 3 of us sat, my father in his chair, Charlotte on the couch, me on the wooden chair they keep near the bookshelf that no one ever uses for anything except sitting in when you're a guest in your own father's house. The curling match went on. Nobody said anything for a while. Then my father said, "I'd like James to have a key." Charlotte didn't answer immediately. "Charlotte," my father said, "I'd like just to have a key." She said, "Dad, we talked about this." "I know," he said. "I'd like James to have a key." That was it. That was all he said. But the way he said it, just the once, just that clearly, just that finally, I don't know. I've heard my father say a lot of things in my life. That might be in the top 5. Charlotte went to her purse without another word and handed me a key. She didn't look at me when she did it. I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that wasn't going to make it worse. I stayed for 2 hours. We watched the curling. My father fell asleep in his chair about halfway through, the way he does, chin dropping to his chest. And Charlotte and I sat there on either side of him and didn't speak, which was fine. The quiet was better than more words. When I left, Charlotte walked me to the door. She said, "I'm not doing this to hurt you." I said, "I know." She said, "I just don't want to lose him." I said, "Neither do I." We didn't hug, we're not that family, but she nodded at me. And I nodded back, and I went out to my truck and drove home. That was late February. In March, my father started going to a drop-in program at a community center in Barrie, the Allendale Recreation Center on Bayview Drive. It was Gordon's suggestion, the physiotherapist. They had a seniors mobility program on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, run by the center's recreation staff, and Gordon thought the group setting would do my father good. My father went once and came back quieter than usual, which with Norman Fielding is saying something, but he went again the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. The coordinator of the program was a woman named Susan Okafor, 55, retired teacher, ran the seniors programming at Allendale with the kind of organized warmth that makes people feel both taken care of and not patronized. My father mentioned her name a few times in the way he mentions things, which is without elaboration, just the name dropped into a sentence. Susan said, "We're adding a balance component next month. Susan knows a good place for lunch near here." I noted the name. With my father, if he mentions a name twice, the person matters. Around the middle of March, I drove to Barrie on a Thursday and picked my father up from Allendale after the program. He came out with a few other people his age, talking to an older man with a cane. He finished his conversation, walked to the truck, climbed in with the ease that was visibly better than February. We drove toward home. He was in a better mood than I'd seen him in months. "Good morning?" I asked. "Good program," he said. "Good people." We stopped at Tim Hortons. He got a large coffee and a maple-glazed donut and ate the donut with a focus that told me he'd probably been eating Charlotte's crackers again. I got a coffee and watched the traffic on Bayview. "Susan asked about you," my father said. "She knows about me. I talk about you." A pause. "She said her husband was the same way with his father. Took him years to sort out." I looked at him. "Did you tell her everything?" "Enough," he said, which with my father means yes. When we got back to the house, there was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. A dark blue Subaru with a McGill Faculty of Medicine sticker on the back window and a Barrie General Hospital parking pass hanging from the mirror. My father looked at it and said nothing, which means he recognized it. "Who's that?" I asked. "Fellow from the program," he said. He said he might stop by. We went inside. Sitting at the kitchen table, drinking a glass of water, was a man who stood when we came in. He was in his early 60s, maybe 62 or 63, with gray at his temples and the kind of hands that are always slightly calloused, which surprised me, given the McGill sticker. He was wearing a fleece vest over a button-down shirt, the outfit of someone who'd retired from formality, but not from attention. He put out his hand. "Mr. Fielding," he said to my father. Then he looked at me. "You must be James." "I am," I said. "I'm Henry Baxter," he said. He shook my hand and then he said, "Your father probably hasn't told you much about me. That's fine. I've been waiting for the right moment to say something, and I think this might be it." We sat down at the table, my father across from Henry, me at the end, the same spot I've sat at for 40 years. My father made tea. Henry Baxter waited, patient and calm, while my father moved around the kitchen the way he does, and I watched this man I'd seen before, tried to understand what I was looking at. Henry Baxter was 63 years old, orthopedic surgeon, recently retired, 30-plus years at Barrie General. Before Barrie, he'd done his residency in Ottawa, and before that, McGill. He'd grown up in Sudbury. He'd been coming to the Allendale Mobility Program not as a patient but as a volunteer, one morning a week, because his own father had used a similar program years ago, and it had made a difference. And after he retired, he'd wanted somewhere to put what he knew about joints and balance, and the particular stubbornness of older men. He had met my father 3 weeks earlier. He said all of this in the kind of straightforward way that some people manage when they've spent decades telling patients things they need to hear, and they've learned to just say the true thing simply. Then he looked at my father and said, "Norman, you want to tell him, or should I?" My father wrapped both hands around his tea mug. He said to me, "This is the man that pulled me out of the car." I looked at my father. Henry Baxter said, "Highway 26. November 1994. Your father already knows the whole story. He told me about it 3 weeks ago when he found out I was from Barrie. I wasn't sure it was the same man, but I looked into it and it was Highway 26, November 1994. I was 23 years old. My father had been driving home from a job site outside Collingwood in an early snowstorm, the kind of lake-effect snow that comes off Georgian Bay and turns a familiar road unfamiliar in 40 minutes. He'd hit black ice on a curve and gone off the road. The truck had rolled. He'd been pinned. A man driving behind him had pulled over, called 911 from a payphone at a garage half a kilometer back, run to the truck, and stayed with my father for 45 minutes in the snow until the ambulance came. My father had a broken collarbone, 3 fractured ribs, and a concussion. He spent 5 days in hospital in Collingwood. When he was discharged, he asked about the man who'd stopped. Nobody knew. There had been a name in the accident report, a witness. But by the time my father was well enough to follow up, the name had led nowhere. This was 1994. There was no easy way to find someone you'd lost. He had talked about it, in the way he talks about things, once clearly, and then not again but present the whole time underneath. The man who stopped, the man who stayed. Henry Baxter had been 29 years old in November 1994. He was a second-year resident at Ottawa General. He'd been driving back to Ottawa from a weekend in Collingwood. The first proper time off he'd had in months, he told us, when he saw the truck leave the road. He'd pulled over. He'd run to the garage. He'd come back and stayed. "You kept saying you had to get home," Henry said to my father. "You said it 4 or 5 times. I kept telling you the ambulance was coming. You said you had a wife and 2 kids. My father nodded slowly. I remember saying that. I never found out what happened to you, Henry said. Back then, you couldn't easily look someone up. I thought about it for years. I'm not exaggerating that. I thought about you for years. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a bird was at the feeder my father keeps on the fence post, and the refrigerator made its usual sound, and the three of us sat there with that between us. I want to try to describe what I felt in that moment, but I'm not sure I have the right words for it. Something shifted in the room, or in me. All the weeks of locked doors and Charlotte's car in the driveway and voicemails gone unreturned. All of it was still there. I'm not saying it disappeared. But there was this other thing suddenly present. This line running from 1994 to now. From a curve on Highway 26 in a snowstorm to a kitchen table in Barrie in March. My father's calloused hands around a tea mug, Henry Baxter's steady eyes. And it made everything else feel different in scale. My father said, I always meant to thank you. Henry Baxter said, you don't owe me anything. My father said, no, I mean it. I always meant to find you, and thank you. Henry looked at him for a moment. Then he said, then let me say this, watching you in that program, coming back every Thursday working at it, that's thanks enough. That's the whole thing. We sat together for another hour. Henry Baxter stayed for tea and then for more tea, and my father told stories I hadn't heard in years. Stories about the road jobs up north, about working with a crew in -30 weather outside Timmins, about the summer my mother had come to visit a job site and they'd had a picnic in the cab of the excavator because it was the only shelter for miles. Henry laughed in the right places. He was good company, the kind that doesn't try to be. When he got up to leave, he shook my hand again. He said, your father's a good man. I said, I know. He said he talked about you every Thursday. I want you to know that. I looked at my father, who was already looking out the window at the bird feeder, and not at me, which is how he handles things that matter. Every Thursday, Henry said again. I drove home to Collingwood that evening on the 26th. The same highway, different season, everything green now, the bay glittering off to the right through the trees. I thought about 1994. I thought about a 29-year-old man who stopped when he didn't have to, who ran to a payphone in a snowstorm, who stayed for 45 minutes beside an overturned truck, talking to a man he didn't know, telling him the ambulance was coming. I thought about my father saying, I have a wife and 2 kids. He had a wife and 2 kids. He was fighting to come home, and a stranger had made sure he got the chance. Charlotte called me a week later. It was a Sunday, which is when she used to call our father before Vincent, so I think that was intentional, or maybe not, but I choose to think it was. She said she'd heard about Henry Baxter. My father had told her. She was quiet for a moment on the line, the particular quiet that Charlotte has when she's working something out. She said, I've been thinking about when Mom died. I said, I know. I thought if I could just keep everything organized, it would be different this time. It's not going to be different, I said. He's getting older. That's what's happening. I know, she said. I know that. Another pause. Then, do you want to come for Easter? I'll tell Vincent we're doing it at Dad's. Yeah, I said. I'll be there. Easter was good. Not perfect. There were moments, Vincent saying something about long-term planning, that my father fielded with a patience I do not possess. Charlotte slightly overmanaging the meal in a way that is genuinely just who she is. But it was good. My kids drove up from Collingwood. My father sat at the head of his own table with his mobility getting visibly better every week. At some point during dessert, he said, out of nowhere, Henry's coming to the community barbecue in July. I said we'd all be there. Charlotte said, who? My father said, Henry, the man who stopped. She looked at me. I looked at her. Then she looked at our father and said, okay, Dad, we'll be there. Henry Baxter keeps coming to the mobility program on Thursdays. My father goes every Tuesday and Thursday now, not because he has to, but because, as he put it, it gets me out of the house and Susan runs a tight ship. His hip has improved beyond what Dr. Anand expected at this stage of recovery. He shoveled his own front walk in April, just a light spring snowfall, and sent me a photo of himself standing beside the cleared path with the same expression he's always had in photographs, which is the expression of a man who has done what needed doing and sees no reason to make a big deal out of it. I kept the photo. I look at it sometimes when things are complicated, at school, with my kids, with Charlotte, with whatever it is that life decides to do next. My father, standing beside a cleared path, 74 years old, still there. There's a line I've come back to, something Henry Baxter said the second time I met him, a Thursday in April when I drove to Barrie and sat in on the program and watched my father do his balance exercises with a focus that would have been embarrassing if he weren't so obviously improving. Henry said it quietly, almost to himself, watching the group. The best thing about kindness is that it doesn't know when to stop. I've thought about that a lot since. The man who stopped on Highway 26 in 1994 had no idea what he was starting. He didn't stop because he knew it would matter in 30 years. He stopped because a truck was in the ditch and a man was inside it. That's all there was. That's all there needed to be. My father is not a man who talks about feelings or lessons or what things mean. But last month, when I was leaving after a Sunday visit, spring now, the birch trees leafed out, the bay visible from his front step on a clear day. He stood in the door and watched me walk to my truck, and as I was getting in, he said, "I'm glad you kept coming." Just that. Just those 5 words. I'm glad you kept coming. I drove home on the 26th and I thought, so am I, Dad, so am I.